In the small, sleepy town of Maple Hollow, nothing ever truly disturbed the rhythm of daily life. With its neatly trimmed lawns, white picket fences, and polite nods exchanged between neighbors, it was the kind of place where everyone assumed they knew everything about everyone. Most homes had stood for decades, passed from one generation to the next. People kept to themselves, but in a friendly sort of way. That's why the events at the old Collins residence sent a chill through the entire community. Margaret Collins lived in one of those big aging houses at the end of Birch Lane, a quiet street flanked by towering oak trees and lined with cracked sidewalks. Her home was one of the oldest in the town, its white paint faded and peeling slightly, ivy creeping up its walls like time itself trying to reclaim the place. Despite its weary appearance, it still held a kind of charm, much like Margaret herself. At 85, Margaret was known to many in Maple Hollow as a kind, soft-spoken woman. She had spent her entire adult life as an elementary school teacher. Her students remembered her as strict but fair, always dressed in cardigans and long skirts, her silver hair coiled in a tight bun. After retiring, she became somewhat of a recluse, rarely seen outside her house except for occasional grocery trips and Sunday church service. Yet even as she faded from the spotlight of town affairs, no one had a bad word to say about her. Her grandson Jason, on the other hand, was a different story. He had arrived in Maple Hollow nearly a year ago, dropped off unceremoniously by his mother, Margaret's daughter, Teresa. Rumors swirled that Teresa had gotten into trouble in another state, but no one knew the details. She left town shortly, after promising to send for Jason once she was settled, but she never returned. Jason was only 16, but he already carried the heavy presence of someone much older. He had a withdrawn look in his eyes, always avoiding contact, always silent. He rarely went to school and was often seen walking aimlessly through the neighborhood at odd hours. Kids his age avoided him, and adults pitied him. The general assumption was that he was just another troubled teen, abandoned by his parent and taken in by a kindly grandmother doing her best. When the smell started drifting from the Collins house, people assumed it was something small, perhaps a dead animal under the porch or spoiled food left out too long. It wasn't unusual for elderly residents to forget things, but when days passed and no one had seen Margaret or Jason, concern began to spread. It was Mrs. Pennington, the Collins' next-door neighbor, who finally called the police. She told them she hadn't seen Margaret pick up her mail or water her garden in nearly a week. The two officers who responded that day had no idea what they were walking into. As they approached the front door, the foul odor hit them, sharp, pungent, and unmistakably wrong. They knocked, waited, then knocked again. No response. With no other choice, they forced their way in. What they found inside sent shockwaves through the entire town. The living room looked undisturbed at first glance, though cluttered and dusty. But as they moved deeper into the house, the horror unfolded. In one of the back bedrooms, both Margaret and Jason were found dead. Their bodies were twisted. Blood pooled thick around them, staining the wooden floors dark. The scene was chaotic, furniture overturned, broken glass scattered across the rug, a sense of violence that felt deeply personal. Initially, investigators suspected a home invasion gone wrong. Perhaps someone had broken in and the situation escalated. But that theory quickly fell apart. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints other than Margaret's and Jason's. The doors had been locked from the inside, and the back windows were still latched. The only weapon found was a bloodied kitchen knife on the floor beside Margaret's outstretched hand. The medical examiner determined that both had died from stab wounds. Margaret had multiple deep lacerations across her torso, while Jason had a single fatal wound to the chest. His hands showed defensive injuries, bruises and cuts consistent with trying to fend off an attacker. Still, nothing made sense. Why would a grandmother and her teenage grandson turn on each other like this? Word of the discovery traveled fast. Maple Hollow was gripped by disbelief. The local paper's front page ran the headline, "Double Tragedy Rocks Quiet Neighborhood." For days, whispers spread through coffee shops, churches, and school parking lots. No one could make sense of what had happened. What shocked everyone even more was how little anyone knew about Jason. No one had really tried to get close to him. Some neighbors admitted they avoided him entirely. Others said Margaret discouraged visitors, insisting she and her grandson needed time alone. One woman confessed she once saw Jason in the window late at night, staring out into the street, unmoving like a statue. The more police dug, the more disturbing things became. A team was sent to search the house thoroughly. What they found behind locked drawers and hidden compartments would change the nature of the investigation forever. Among the personal items were stacks of journals, meticulously kept by Margaret over several years. But one in particular, dated during the months Jason had lived with her, stood out. It began innocently enough, with entries about how lonely she had been before Jason came, how his presence brought new light into her life. But the tone shifted. Quickly, her words became romantic, obsessive, even possessive. She wrote of dreams in which they were together as lovers, of feeling young again, of experiencing a kind of passion she thought was long gone. There were drawings too, crude sketches, of Jason, sometimes shirtless, sometimes posed like a model. These were not the ramblings of a senile old woman. They were methodical, intentional, and deeply disturbing. Authorities now faced a horrifying possibility, that the relationship between Margaret and Jason had turned into something unnatural, perhaps even abusive. Had Jason been manipulated? Had he tried to escape, and had that struggle turned deadly? Nothing was certain yet, but the town of Maple Hollow would never be the same. Beneath its quiet surface had been a secret so twisted, so unimaginable, that it left everyone questioning how well they really knew the people around them. The more the investigators delved into the lives of Margaret and Jason Collins, the more tangled and unsettling the story became. What had started as a tragic murder case quickly evolved into something far darker, one that challenged every assumption about family, trust, and obsession. The seemingly quiet bond between the elderly grandmother and her teenage grandson hid layers of secrets nobody could have predicted. Jason's arrival in Maple Hollow was a quiet event at first. After his mother left town, he was placed in Margaret's care, a solution that seemed simple on paper but soon revealed cracks beneath its surface. From the beginning, neighbors noticed a strange dynamic between the two. While Margaret appeared protective and nurturing in public, Jason's behavior seemed increasingly withdrawn and anxious. He rarely interacted with anyone else, spending most of his time inside the house or wandering the streets alone after dark. Locals started to speak in hushed tones about the unusual closeness Margaret and Jason shared. Unlike typical grandparents doting on their grandchildren, Margaret's attention bordered on fixation. She was always watching Jason, following his movements through the house, waiting for him to return from school or the corner store. At times, she seemed almost desperate to keep him close, refusing to let him out of her sight. Jason, for his part, was silent and reserved. Some neighbors who had tried to engage him were met with cold stares or outright avoidance. He never spoke about his mother, or his past, and he appeared terrified whenever anyone mentioned leaving the house or the possibility of moving away. It was clear he was trapped, emotionally, if not physically, within the walls of Margaret's home. Police soon discovered that Margaret had meticulously controlled every aspect of Jason's life. She monitored his phone calls, dictated his daily routine, and limited his contact with anyone outside the household. Social services had never been called, partly because Margaret was well-liked and presented herself as a caring guardian. But behind closed doors, the atmosphere was suffocating and oppressive. Then came the discovery of Margaret's journals. These writings revealed a mind consumed by obsession. Her entries detailed a twisted love for Jason that went far beyond familial affection. She described him as her soulmate, the person who had brought meaning back to her life after decades of loneliness. She wrote of secret moments they shared, quiet evenings reading together, walks in the garden where she held his hand longer than necessary, whispered promises of a future they would share forever. The language was unnerving, filled with a disturbing blend of tenderness and possessiveness. Margaret confessed to feeling a renewed youthfulness through Jason's presence, often describing physical sensations and emotions that were wildly inappropriate for a grandmother. She even spoke of fantasizing about a life with him as more than just family. Authorities found a series of photographs hidden in the pages of the journal, images of Margaret and Jason posing in ways that suggested intimacy far beyond what was normal. In some pictures, they were holding hands. In others, their faces were pressed close together, eyes locked in silent communication. The photos seemed staged, as if Margaret wanted to preserve memories of a secret relationship no one else could understand. As police pieced together this evidence, the town's perception shifted dramatically. What was once a story about a lonely grandmother taking care of a troubled teen now became a tale of manipulation, control, and possibly abuse. Some speculated that Margaret's advanced age gave her a fragile hold on reality, that she had convinced herself of a forbidden love. Others wondered if Jason had been groomed and trapped by her, unable to break free because of fear or emotional blackmail. Further investigation into Jason's own writings complicated the narrative even more. A journal found concealed beneath a floorboard in his bedroom revealed a young mind struggling with confusion and despair. Jason's entries spoke of feeling trapped and powerless. He described Margaret as controlling and dangerous, and wrote about her threatening to harm herself if he ever left her side. He was terrified of upsetting her, but desperate for freedom. The journal contained detailed accounts of heated arguments between them. Jason wrote about nights filled with shouting and threats, about moments when Margaret's affection turned to anger, and how he feared for his own safety. Despite this, there were also passages expressing deep care and love for Margaret, showing his conflicted emotions and the complexity of their bond. One entry was particularly chilling. Dated just one day before their deaths, Jason wrote that he was planning to end it all because he couldn't see any way out of their situation. He expressed sorrow and regret, apologizing for what was to come but showing no clear plan. This note raised countless questions. Was he preparing to take his own life? Did he intend to confront Margaret? Was the violence the result of a desperate, final struggle? The investigators interviewed friends of Jason from his previous school, who confirmed that he had changed drastically after moving in with Margaret. Once outgoing and cheerful, he had become withdrawn and fearful, rarely talking about his home life. His teachers noticed frequent absences and signs of emotional distress, but were unaware of the reasons. Margaret's neighbors recalled hearing Loud arguments late at night, shouts and slamming doors that shattered the usual calm of Birch Lane. No one had called the police before, assuming it was just family tension that would pass. But now, these memories took on a darker meaning, a warning sign that had gone ignored. The police also uncovered financial records revealing that Margaret had recently changed her will, leaving the majority of her estate to Jason. This legal move was unexpected and suspicious. It suggested that she was planning for Jason to inherit everything, perhaps hoping they could start a new life together far from Maple Hollow. The extent of Margaret's influence over Jason was clear in these documents, showing control not only over his daily life but over his future as well. As the case unfolded, the lines between victim and perpetrator blurred. Was Margaret a lonely old woman driven mad by her desires, or was she a manipulative figure who trapped and harmed her own grandson? Was Jason a helpless victim trying to escape, or someone pushed to the brink who fought back in self-defense? The town was left grappling with these questions, unable to fully understand the tragedy that had taken place behind the walls of the Collins home. The secret romance, if it could even be called that, was a dark and twisted bond that ended in bloodshed. Maple Hollow's peaceful facade had been shattered, exposing a heartbreaking story of obsession, control, and desperate struggle. What began as an unlikely relationship between an elderly grandmother and her teenage grandson had spiraled into a nightmare no one could have predicted, and a bloody murder that would haunt the town for years to come. In the quiet stillness of the Collins household, hidden away from prying eyes, lay secrets that only came to light after the devastating tragedy. Among the many pieces of evidence uncovered by the police was a journal unlike any other, a battered, leather-bound book that had been carefully concealed behind a loose floorboard in Jason's bedroom. This journal became the key to unraveling the disturbing truth about the relationship between Jason and his grandmother, Margaret. Jason's handwriting was shaky and inconsistent, as if the act of writing brought him both relief and fear. The entries spanned several months, beginning shortly after he moved in with Margaret. At first, the tone was cautious, but hopeful. Jason described his new living situation as peaceful, even comforting, a refuge from the turmoil of his past. He wrote about quiet afternoons spent reading in the sunlit living room, about Margaret's kindness in small moments, the warmth of her cooking, the way she always made sure he had clean clothes. But as the pages turned, a dark shift began to take hold. The journal entries grew fragmented and hurried. Jason spoke of feelings he struggled to explain, confusion, fear, and growing unease. He described Margaret's attention as overwhelming, an all-consuming force that left him feeling trapped and powerless. There were passages where Jason recounted instances of manipulation, moments when Margaret's kindness quickly turned into anger or threats. One entry stood out in particular. Jason wrote about how Margaret would threaten to harm herself if he tried to leave her or contact anyone outside the house. He described the psychological grip she had on him, how her words could send him into panic and guilt. He felt responsible for her well-being in a way that no teenager should, burdened by a twisted sense of duty and fear. The journal revealed the disturbing reality that Jason was living under constant emotional pressure, unable to find a way out. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, Jason's writings also revealed his complex emotions toward Margaret. He did not hate her. There were moments when he expressed genuine care and concern, calling her the only family I have left, and acknowledging that she had taken him in when no one else would. He was torn between wanting to escape and feeling loyalty toward the woman who had become his guardian. This emotional turmoil made his situation even more heartbreaking. The final entries in the journal painted a chilling picture of desperation. Jason wrote that he had reached a breaking point. He could no longer endure the constant threats and emotional manipulation. He described the fear he felt every time Margaret's mood shifted from gentle to violent. He wrote of sleepless nights, spent listening to her pacing the halls, of arguments that escalated into shouting and broken objects. Most striking was the last entry, dated just one day before their deaths. In it, Jason expressed a plan to end it all, though he did not clarify whether that meant ending his own life or the nightmare he was trapped in. His words were full of sorrow and regret, an apology to anyone who might find his writings. There was a sense of finality in the tone, as if he had made a difficult decision but was unsure of what the future held. This journal shattered the initial assumptions about the case. The police now saw the events leading to the murders as the climax of a long, painful struggle between two people bound by love, fear, and control. The picture that emerged was not one of simple victim and aggressor, but of a tragic relationship, marked by abuse, manipulation, and emotional torture. In addition to the journal, the police uncovered other pieces of evidence that shed light on the dark undercurrents in the Collins household. Photographs hidden among Margaret's belongings showed a disturbing level of intimacy. Some images captured moments of tenderness, but others hinted at something more disturbing. Poses that suggested an unnatural closeness, expressions that seemed more intense than the affection between a grandmother and grandson should be. Neighbors and friends were interviewed again, and some recalled moments they had dismissed at the time, but which now seemed significant. A woman who lived down the street remembered seeing Jason and Margaret walking hand in hand late at night, their faces serious and solemn. Others mentioned overhearing strange conversations through thin walls, whispers that carried an urgent, secretive tone. Police also uncovered a small, outdated video camera hidden in the hallway near the bedrooms. It was one of those old security devices Margaret had installed years ago, possibly to monitor her late husband's health. The footage, though grainy and incomplete, recorded sounds from the house on the night of the murders. Investigators heard the faint sounds of a struggle, shuffling feet, a crash of falling objects, and muffled thuds. The audio ended abruptly, leaving the events open to interpretation but confirming that a violent confrontation had occurred. Financial documents provided another piece of the puzzle. In the months before her death, Margaret had altered her will to leave the majority of her estate to Jason. She had also withdrawn large sums of money from her savings, though where the funds went remained a mystery. This sudden financial shift raised questions about Margaret's intentions. Was she planning to escape with Jason, or was this part of a deeper plan to control his future? Investigators discovered that Margaret had cut off nearly all of Jason's contact with the outside world. She controlled his access to phones and emails, monitored his social media accounts, and restricted visits from friends or extended family. This level of control suggested a calculated effort to isolate him, making it difficult for Jason to seek help or escape. All these pieces together painted a grim picture. Margaret's obsession with Jason had morphed into something toxic and suffocating. She had constructed a world where she was the center of his existence, and Jason, whether out of fear or loyalty, remained trapped inside it. Their relationship was a dangerous mix of love and control, with devastating consequences. As the investigation moved forward, the question of who was the ultimate aggressor became more complicated. The autopsy report had shown that Margaret had inflicted multiple wounds on Jason, but Jason had managed to fight back with a fatal stab wound. The forensic evidence suggested that the final moments were a chaotic and desperate struggle for survival. Neither survived the violent encounter, leaving behind only fragments of a story too painful to fully comprehend. Maple Hollow struggled to come to terms with what had happened behind the walls of the Collins house. The secret romance that had been whispered about in private was now laid bare for all to see, a story of obsession, fear, and shattered lives. The journal, the photographs, the recordings, all revealed the heartbreaking truth that some bonds, no matter how close they seem, can become deadly when twisted by manipulation and control. The tragedy left a lasting scar on the town. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers were forced to reconsider what they thought they knew about love and family. The case of Margaret and Jason Collins became a cautionary tale about the dangers of secrecy and obsession, and a reminder that sometimes the darkest stories lie hidden where we least expect them. The days following the discovery of the murders were filled with a growing sense of disbelief and sorrow throughout Maple Hollow. The tragic end of Margaret and Jason Collins left many wondering how something so dark and twisted could have gone unnoticed for so long in their quiet community. The investigators found themselves piecing together the final hours before the bloody confrontation, hoping to understand what had driven the two to such a devastating conclusion. One of the most important breakthroughs came from forensic analysis and witness accounts, slowly reconstructing the timeline leading up to the tragedy. On the evening before the murders, Margaret had been seen at the local grocery store, purchasing unusual quantities of household items, cleaning supplies, several large kitchen knives, and bottles of wine. Her behavior was erratic. She appeared tense, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to follow her. This was unusual for the typically reserved woman, sparking suspicion among the few who observed her. Inside the house, neighbors reported hearing raised voices late into the night. The Collins residence, usually quiet, was filled with the sounds of shouting, doors slamming, and occasional crashing noises. These disturbances startled the neighborhood, though most assumed it was a typical family argument and did not intervene. Later, investigators would discover that this night marked the beginning of the final breakdown between grandmother and grandson. The police recovered a series of texts from Jason's phone, though many messages had been deleted or erased. Among the recovered texts were frantic notes from Jason pleading for help and expressing fear. He mentioned feeling trapped, desperate to escape, and worried about Margaret's increasing instability. There were also messages from Margaret herself, full of possessive and threatening language, warning Jason not to leave or involve others. These texts revealed a dangerous cycle of manipulation and fear that had been escalating in the days before their deaths. As the night unfolded, it became clear that the situation had spiraled out of control. The forensic evidence showed that the struggle began in the kitchen, where the first wounds were inflicted. Blood spatters on the walls and broken utensils indicated a violent fight. Investigators believed Margaret had attacked Jason first, possibly in a moment of rage or fear, that he was trying to leave her. Jason fought back, desperate to defend himself against the relentless assault. The violence moved throughout the house, with blood trails leading from the kitchen to the living room and eventually to the back hallway. It was here that the final, fatal confrontation occurred. The forensic team found signs that Jason had been stabbed multiple times, but not before he had delivered a critical wound to Margaret that proved deadly. The chaos of the scene suggested a battle for survival, neither willing to yield until the very end. The exact motive behind the murders remained difficult to pin down, but investigators pieced together possible triggers based on evidence and interviews. One key factor appeared to be Margaret's paranoia and jealousy. She believed that Jason was planning to leave her and feared abandonment more than anything else. Her altered will and financial decisions suggested she was preparing for a life where they could be together, isolated from the outside world. When Jason tried to resist or break free, it set off a chain reaction that ended in bloodshed. Interviews with friends and family revealed even more about the toxic environment inside the Collins home. Jason's few remaining relatives described Margaret as controlling and manipulative, someone who had isolated him from his support network. They spoke of her tendency to exaggerate illnesses and play on emotions to keep others in line. Jason's estranged mother, though distant, expressed deep concern over Margaret's influence and the impact it had on her son's mental health. Despite the grim findings, some aspects of the case puzzled the investigators. For example, the absence of any signs of forced entry suggested that both Margaret and Jason had been trapped inside by their own choices or circumstances. Police found no indication that an outsider had interfered or that anyone else was involved in the fatal fight. It was a tragic story of two people locked in a deadly embrace of their own making. Psychologists who later reviewed the case described the relationship between Margaret and Jason as a textbook example of folie à deux, a shared psychosis where two individuals develop a close but unhealthy bond that distorts their reality. In this case, Margaret's obsessive fixation on Jason and Jason's mixed feelings of love and fear created a toxic dynamic that escalated into violence. Their isolation from the outside world only intensified these dangerous emotions. The community was left to grapple with the aftermath of the murders. Support groups and counseling services were offered to neighbors who had been affected by the shocking events. Maple Hollow's tight-knit population struggled to accept that beneath their peaceful streets, such a dark and disturbing story had unfolded. The tragedy served as a painful reminder of how hidden struggles can remain invisible until it is too late. Local authorities also began reviewing their own response to the situation. Questions arose about whether social services or law enforcement could have intervened sooner, and what warning signs might have been missed. The case sparked conversations about the need for better monitoring of vulnerable individuals, especially when unusual family dynamics and isolation are involved. It highlighted the importance of community awareness and the courage to act when something seems wrong. As the media covered the story, the title, "Secret Romance Between 85-Year-Old Grandmother and 16-Year-Old Grandson Ends in Bloody Murder," captured public attention, but it also raised ethical questions. Many questioned how such a sensational headline could obscure the deeper tragedy of abuse, fear, and mental illness. Journalists debated the responsibility to tell the story with sensitivity, focusing on the human cost rather than the lurid details. Behind the headlines, the true victims were clear. 2 lives lost in a heartbreaking spiral of obsession and despair. Margaret and Jason's story was a stark warning of the dangers that can arise when love becomes twisted by control and fear. It was a tragedy that neither deserved, yet one that forced an entire town to confront uncomfortable truths about family, isolation, and the fragile boundaries between affection and obsession. As the investigation wrapped up, the files were closed, but the scars remained. Maple Hollow slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, but the memory of that terrible night lingered. For the people who knew Margaret and Jason, and for those who only heard the story afterward, the tragedy served as a lasting reminder. Sometimes, the most dangerous secrets are hidden behind the closest bonds. The aftermath of the horrific murders in the Collins household rippled far beyond the small town of Maple Hollow. As details emerged and the full story came to light, the community faced a painful reckoning with the unsettling reality behind what had once seemed like a simple family tragedy. The final chapter in this tragic saga unfolded not just in the courtroom, but in the hearts and minds of those who struggled to understand how such darkness could take root in a seemingly ordinary home. In the weeks following the discovery, investigators and legal experts prepared to piece together the final narrative that would be presented in court. Since both Margaret and Jason were deceased, there were no suspects to prosecute. However, authorities still aimed to document the events in a detailed report that would serve as a cautionary record for law enforcement and social services alike. This report would be studied for years to come, a stark reminder of how hidden abuses can escalate beyond recognition. The toxic nature of Margaret and Jason's relationship left the town grappling with a myriad of questions. How had an 85-year-old woman and her 16-year-old grandson developed such a deeply disturbing bond? What signs had been missed, and could anyone have intervened to prevent the tragedy? More than anything, the story challenged conventional notions of family and love, exposing how obsession and manipulation could mask themselves beneath the guise of care and protection. Therapists and psychologists consulted on the case described the relationship as a tragic example of emotional entrapment. Margaret, vulnerable due to age and possibly mental decline, had formed a dangerous attachment to Jason, whose own troubled past made him susceptible to her control. The emotional abuse they inflicted on each other created a closed world where fear, dependence, and confusion ruled. This shared psychological prison left no room for escape, ultimately exploding into violence. The revelation of this secret romance shocked many in Maple Hollow, who had regarded Margaret as a sweet, albeit eccentric elderly woman. The townspeople struggled to reconcile the grandmother they thought they knew with the person capable of such possessiveness and violence. Jason, too, was re-examined, not merely as a victim or perpetrator, but as a deeply conflicted young man, caught in a nightmare beyond his control. Community leaders began calling for greater awareness about elder abuse and teenage mental health, emphasizing the importance of outreach programs and early intervention. The Collins case became a catalyst for local reforms, including improved training for social workers and enhanced monitoring of vulnerable families. The hope was that by learning from this tragedy, similar situations could be identified and addressed before reaching such a deadly outcome. As months passed, the Collins home itself became a symbol of the tragedy. The house was sold at auction and eventually demolished, with neighbors expressing relief that the physical reminder of the horrors inside would no longer cast a shadow over the neighborhood. Some locals held memorials for Jason and Margaret, not to celebrate their actions, but to mourn the loss of two human lives caught in a devastating cycle of pain and desperation. The media coverage of the case continued to provoke mixed reactions. Some outlets were criticized for sensationalizing the story, focusing on the scandalous nature of the relationship rather than the underlying issues of abuse and mental illness. Advocates for responsible journalism called for a more compassionate approach, one that highlighted the need for support systems rather than judgment and stigma. Meanwhile, Jason's extended family began the slow process of healing. His estranged mother, who had struggled with addiction and distance from her son, reached out to community support groups and vowed to raise awareness about the dangers of isolation and abuse. She hoped that sharing Jason's story could prevent others from suffering similar fates. Despite the pain, there was a collective determination among family members to transform their grief into positive change. In schools throughout the region, educators incorporated discussions about mental health, family dynamics, and recognizing signs of abuse into their curricula. Counselors were trained to spot warning signals and provide resources to students who might be facing similar challenges. The Collins case became a somber lesson, reminding young people that help is available and that silence can be deadly. Throughout all these efforts, the core message remained clear. The tragedy of Margaret and Jason Collins was a heartbreaking example of what can happen when love becomes twisted into control and fear. It revealed the dangers of secrecy and the devastating effects of emotional imprisonment. Their story was a warning that even the closest bonds can hide darkness if left unchecked. Despite the efforts to move forward, the story haunted those who had been closest to the family. Friends who had tried to reach Jason before the murders grappled with guilt and helplessness. They questioned whether they had done enough, or if they had missed crucial signs of his distress. The town of Maple Hollow mourned not just the violent end, but the slow unraveling that had led to it. A reminder of how invisible pain can grow when no one is watching. In the end, the case of the secret romance between an 85-year-old grandmother and her 16-year-old grandson ended in tragedy, but it also sparked a movement toward awareness and prevention. It taught communities about the importance of vigilance, compassion, and intervention in situations of family dysfunction. The legacy of Margaret and Jason Collins was a call to action, to listen carefully, to act bravely, and to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Their story remains etched in the history of Maple Hollow, a somber chapter that changed the town forever. It is a reminder that behind closed doors, even the most unlikely relationships can harbor secrets capable of destroying lives. The hope is that, by sharing their story with honesty and care, others might find the courage to break, free from their own hidden prisons before it is too late.